Nobody knows what happens when you die. Not your religion, not your doctor, not your philosopher, not me. And here's the thing that actually matters. There's a difference between having an answer and knowing the answer. Almost everyone has an answer. Your culture handed you one before you were old enough to question it. Your grandmother had one. Your religious tradition has one. Science has one. But knowing, actually knowing, the way you know water boils at 100 degrees, the way you know the earth orbits the sun, nobody is there, not even close. So what I want to do is follow the question honestly, through the physics, through the neuroscience, through the philosophy, all the way to the edge of what we actually know, and then stand at that edge and look at what's past it. Because what's past it is more interesting than any answer I've been given. Start with what death actually is, not the poetry, the machine. Most people imagine death as a moment, a switch flipping off. 1 second you're there, next second you're not. Biology is messier than that. Death is a cascade. The heart stops. Oxygen delivery to the brain fails. Within seconds, neurons begin losing their electrochemical gradients, the voltage differences across their membranes that allow them to fire. Within 4 to 6 minutes without oxygen, irreversible damage begins in the most sensitive regions. Within hours, cellular machinery collapses across the entire body. It's not a switch, it's a process, a long, staggered, region-by-region dimming. And medicine has shown that the line is movable. People have been resuscitated after 40 minutes of clinical death, after the heart stopped, after breathing stopped, after they were, by every conventional measure, gone. And they came back. Not always intact. Oxygen deprivation has consequences, but back. The line between dead and not dead has shifted repeatedly as medical technology improved, which means the line was never quite where we thought it was. What actually dies? The organized pattern, the specific electrochemical configuration of 86 billion neurons connected by 100 trillion synaptic links that produces, somehow, through mechanisms we don't fully understand, experience. The matter doesn't die. Atoms don't die. The energy doesn't die. It disperses, transforms, moves into the environment. What ends is the arrangement, the particular, improbable, self-sustaining organization that was you. That distinction matters, because the question, what happens after death, is really asking, what happens to that pattern? Does it end completely? Does it transform into something? Does it persist somewhere we can't see? When we define what we're actually asking, we can start to see what the evidence actually says. And the evidence starts here. Consciousness depends on the brain, completely, demonstrably, in every case we've ever studied. Damage the frontal lobe, personality changes. Damage the hippocampus, memory formation stops. Put someone under general anesthesia, consciousness disappears, cleanly, reversibly, on command. Lower blood sugar enough, thinking dissolves into confusion. Cool the brain below a certain temperature, experience stops. Every physical intervention in the brain produces a corresponding change in conscious experience. Every single one, in every direction. There is no documented case of consciousness operating independently of a functioning physical brain. Not one. In all of recorded medicine, in all of neuroscience, in every hospital and laboratory that has ever looked, we have never observed consciousness existing without the biological hardware that generates it. Now, I want to be careful here, because careful is what the question deserves. Correlation isn't proof of causation. When every change in the radio produces a change in the music, it strongly suggests the radio is making the music. But it's conceivable, barely philosophically, that the radio is just receiving it, and damaging the receiver disrupts the reception. Some philosophers hold exactly this view. The brain as receiver, not generator. But the burden of evidence sits heavily on one side. Every single data point we have says, physical substrate, conscious experience. No physical substrate, no evidence of conscious experience. That's where the science stands. Which brings us to the most interesting data in this entire conversation. Near-death experiences. These are real. The experiences are real. Millions of people across every culture, every religion, every demographic, reporting remarkably consistent things. The sense of leaving the body, a tunnel, light, a life review that feels more real than ordinary memory, a profound peace. Sometimes verified perceptions of things happening in other rooms, overheard conversations, details of medical procedures seen from above the body. The neuroscience has been catching up. A 2023 study from the University of Michigan found surges of gamma wave activity, the brain waves associated with the highest levels of conscious processing, in patients at the moment of cardiac arrest. The dying brain, under extreme physiological stress, produces an intense burst of coordinated activity, more coherent in some measurements than ordinary waking consciousness. So here's one honest explanation. The brain, as it loses the oxygen and electrochemical balance it needs to function, goes through a final intense phase of activity before it stops. This produces vivid, meaningful, structured experience. The tunnel, the light, the life review, the brain's last performance, extraordinarily vivid precisely because the inhibitory systems that normally constrain experience are failing. That's a plausible mechanism. It might be right. But then there are the verified perception cases. Patients who were clinically dead, flat EEG, no measurable brain activity, who later reported accurate details of their resuscitation. Objects seen from above, conversations overheard from outside the room. A few of these cases have been investigated carefully. The methodology is contested, the documentation is incomplete, but they exist, and they don't fit cleanly into the dying brain activity explanation, because the brain activity was gone. Pim van Lome ran the largest prospective study of near-death experiences. 344 cardiac arrest patients in Dutch hospitals. 18% reported some NDE experience. All of them were clinically dead during the experience. His conclusion wasn't proof of afterlife. It was, we have a phenomenon that our current neuroscience doesn't fully explain. And that's a serious thing to say. An anomaly you can't explain isn't proof of anything. But an anomaly that's consistent, cross-cultural, and resistant to easy dismissal, that's worth holding carefully rather than throwing away. Now let me go deeper into the physics. Physics has a principle called conservation of information. In quantum mechanics, the total information content of a closed system cannot be destroyed. It can be scrambled, dispersed, transformed beyond any practical recovery. But in principle, the information isn't gone. Stephen Hawking spent decades arguing against this principle in the context of black holes, and eventually conceded. Even black holes, it appears, don't destroy information. They transform it. Your brain, at any moment, is a specific physical configuration. Particles in specific states, entangled in specific ways, carrying specific information in their quantum properties. When you die, that configuration disperses. The atoms scatter into the environment. The energy moves elsewhere. But the information encoded in those physical states, in principle, according to the laws of quantum mechanics, doesn't vanish. Does that mean you survive? Not in any meaningful experiential sense we can point to. A shredded book still contains all its letters. The letters are all there, scattered on the floor, but it's not the book anymore. The question is, were you the letters or were you the book? The arrangement or the matter? And if you were the arrangement, what does it mean for the arrangement to dissolve while the components persist? Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff proposed something more specific. They suggested that quantum processes in structures inside neurons, called microtubules, might be fundamental to consciousness, and that quantum information at death might not simply end, but disperse into the universe in some form. This is not accepted mainstream physics. It's a minority view, but it's a serious minority view from serious scientists that hasn't been disproven. Penrose is not a crank. He's one of the most rigorous mathematical physicists alive. The honest position. Physics tells us matter persists, energy persists, information persists. Physics tells us nothing about whether experience persists. Those might be the same thing, or they might be completely different things. And here's the problem. We can't answer that question until we answer the deeper one. One actually generates consciousness in the first place. David Chalmers named it the hard problem of consciousness. Even if you had a complete physical description of my brain, every neuron, every synapse, every quantum state, you still wouldn't know why any of it produces experience, why there's something it's like to be me, why it's not just dark computation happening in the dark. We don't know the answer. We don't know if consciousness is entirely produced by physical processes and ends when they end. We don't know if it's something more fundamental, a feature of reality itself, like mass or charge, that brains participate in rather than generate. Both positions are held by serious philosophers and scientists. Neither is proven. This matters for the death question in a very direct way. If you don't know what generates consciousness, you can't confidently say what happens to it. You can't trace the ending of something you haven't traced the beginning of. The death question and the consciousness question are the same question, approached from different ends. And there's another body of evidence that doesn't get enough scientific attention: what the dying actually experience in the days and hours before death. Deathbed visions. Distinct from dramatic near-death experiences, these happen before death, not during resuscitation. Dying people, often still conscious and communicative, reporting vivid visions of deceased relatives, of peaceful landscapes, of a sense of being accompanied, of someone coming to meet them. These experiences are calm. They're not frightening. Across thousands of documented cases, they're described as more real than ordinary perception. Christopher Kerr, a hospice physician, has systematically documented thousands of these experiences over decades of practice. They occur in patients not heavily sedated. Medication doesn't explain them. And occasionally they include figures the dying person didn't know were dead. A relative who had died recently, unknown to the patient. Still appearing, still waiting. What does this prove? Probably nothing definitive about what lies beyond death, but it's a consistent, cross-cultural, extensively reported phenomenon at the threshold of dying that our current neuroscience doesn't explain, and we haven't studied it nearly enough. Now I want to tell you something about how I've thought about my own death, because this isn't abstract for me. I've been asked if I'm afraid, and my honest answer is, not really. Not because I know something comforting, because I've looked at the question carefully enough to know that pretending to have an answer would be worse than holding the uncertainty cleanly. What I believe, my atoms will go on to be parts of other things. The patterns I've contributed, the ideas, the students, the problems nudged slightly closer to solution, those persist in other minds, other work, other questions. The universe that made me will use the same material for something else. That's not heaven. It's not reincarnation. It's something more honest and in its own way more remarkable. I find that the time I have becomes more interesting when I stop trying to extend it indefinitely in imagination. When I stop following certainty about what comes after. When I hold the question open. So here's where we actually are. We know what death is physically. We know consciousness depends on the brain, completely, in every case we've studied. We know near-death experiences are real, consistent, cross-cultural, and not fully explained by current neuroscience. We know that information in the physics sense doesn't simply disappear. We know that deathbed visions are a real and understudied phenomenon. We know that the hard problem of consciousness remains unsolved, which means we can't confidently say what consciousness is, where it comes from, or what happens to it. What we don't know, whether experience is reducible to physics or something beyond it, whether the pattern that constitutes a self can persist in any experiential form after the physical substrate dissolves, whether consciousness is something the universe produces locally in brains or something more fundamental that brains temporarily participate in. The honest answer to what happens after death isn't nothing. It isn't heaven. It isn't reincarnation. It's, we are standing at the edge of what physics and neuroscience can currently tell us. Past that edge, the question is genuinely open. Anyone who tells you otherwise, with certainty in either direction, is telling you more than they know, and that edge is not a comfortable place. But it's an honest one, and honest is what the question deserves. What I'm left with, after following this as far as I can follow it, is that the mystery is bigger than I thought when I started, that the question of what happens after death turns out to contain the question of what consciousness is, which turns out to contain the question of what information is, which turns out to sit right at the edge of what physics can currently reach. And somehow, I mean this genuinely, that makes the time I have more interesting, not less. The fact that I don't know what comes after makes what's happening now sharper, more worth paying attention to. I don't know what happens when you die. Neither does anyone else, whatever they tell you. But I've looked at what we do know, followed it as far as it goes, and here's what I'm left with. The question is bigger than I thought, and somehow that's enough to keep going.